Hello, and thank you for joining me on this short video, Less Than Thoroughly Cooked Beef Burgers. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this is the 57th out of a series of 100 short videos that I'm recording on the topic of UK food law topics. You may be watching this video as part of our online training service, and on this particular one that might be pretty helpful because some of the slides that are going to be shown on this rather wonky screen behind me are a bit difficult to read. But if you're a subscriber to our online training service, you can download the actual slides and you'll be able to read them a bit clearly. Also, you'll have access to a webinar about an hour long on the topic of minimally processed foods, which covers this, plus other resources that you can download. But if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, of course, it's free content, you're more than welcome. Okay, so I'm talking about less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers. So what are the issues with a less than thoroughly cooked beef burger? Well, obviously the name itself suggests it's not been completely cooked. So you get a rare beef burger, might be another way of describing it. I'm talking about beef burgers in particular because there are some food safety hazards that are associated with beef burgers in particular, most notably the quite dangerous pathogen E. coli 0157. There is a separate video on E. coli 0157 if you're not that clear about it. But there are of course other food poisoning bacteria that can be associated with rare or raw beef, and that would be, for example, salmonella. Now I'm saying associated with rare beef, but hang on a minute, you might be thinking I regularly eat rare steak, so I've been fine, there's no problem there. Well, the big difference between eating a rare steak and eating a beef burger is, of course, a beef burger is made up of minced beef. If you think about it, if you go back to a slaughterhouse, the most likely place for contamination of a beef carcass to occur is externally within a slaughterhouse. So there could be, for example, dirty cattle presented for slaughter. It could be poor hygiene conditions within the slaughter itself, that sort of thing. Now, if you have a steak, then the contamination will be on the outside of the steak. And so when you cook your steak, even if you don't cook the middle bit, the contamination is removed. The food poisoning bacteria are killed off. They won't typically exist within the muscle of the meat. So therefore, within a steak, that's fine. You can eat your rare steak. But if you have a minced beef burger, using minced beef, then if the beef joint is contaminated on the external surface, if you mince it up, that contamination becomes internalized. It becomes part of the burger itself. So therefore, if you don't cook the burger properly, if you eat it rare, then there may be some dangerous bacteria lurking within the burger itself. So that's the main issue with less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers. It's the mincing up of potentially contaminated beef and then not cooking the beef thoroughly throughout. So when we actually look at this, there are three main issues that the Food Standards Agency considered. And they issued guidance some years ago, but they reissued it in 2023. And I'm just going to run through some of the elements of that guidance, and also I'm going to take some excerpts from it. So the Food Standards Agency recommend, look, there's three main ways of, I suppose, serving up a burger, a beef burger, in a commercial environment. One is you cook it thoroughly. That's probably the best idea. Let's face it, McDonald's have done pretty well out of cooking all of their burgers thoroughly, and I would thoroughly recommend a thorough cook. Number two, I said the issue here is contamination of the external surface of the beef joint. So if you can remove the contamination prior to cooking, then you don't really need to cook it as thoroughly. That's the point. So if you can remove the external contamination, and that's one way of doing it. So in other words, what you do is you can use blanching. You can plunge the beef into boiling water to kill the external contamination. You can use searing. In other words, using something like a frying pan to sear the outside of the meat, again, to kill off the bacteria prior to mincing. You can use shaving. So you can actually just trim off the outer surface of the beef prior to mincing. So if you're using a technique like that, or a combination of them, then you are removing the contamination. The issue there, of course, is now preventing recontamination through cross-contact, through cross-contamination during the actual preparation of the burger. But if you have actually removed the external contamination successfully and then you mince the beef in a hygienic way without reintroducing any contamination, then you should be fine not to cook it thoroughly all the way through, because it's a bit like a rare steak again. The third method is actually using controls in the supply chain. So I said the first method, cook it properly. The third method is using a appropriate and controlled supply chain to ensure that the external contamination is reduced down to an acceptable level where a less than thoroughly cooked process can be applied. And it's that one that I'm actually going to focus on now. So a less than thoroughly cooked burger. So what am I talking about? Well, you need to just quickly revise some of the principles of thermal processing, in other words, cooking. The bottom line is this: if you heat a known population of a known bacteria for a known temperature for a known time, then you'll get a decimal or log reduction of the bacterial numbers. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about D values here, and a D value is a time taken to reduce a population of bacteria by 90%. Let's just look at that more in a sort of colour way, if you like, behind me. So this is a log reduction. If we had an initial bacteria population, say of 100,000 bacteria, so right at the top of that screen there, you can see start 100,000. We've got 100,000 bacteria. If we apply what's known as a 1D cook, then we're going to kill off 90% of those bacteria, and we are going to be left with 10%. So after a 1D cook, we start off with 100,000, we're left with 10,000. We then do a 2D cook. So we're now going to heat it for a further time, which will actually reduce it by another 90%. So we've got our 10,000 reduced down to 1,000. That's a 2D cook. A 3D cook, you're probably getting the hang of this. 3D cook is now reducing it down by 90%. Again, in fact, we can keep applying a D cook. We keep reducing it down by 90% until we get to the thoroughly cooked stage. The one in red at the bottom there is what we would normally call a catering thoroughly cooked process, a 6D cook. You're there, if you had 100,000 bacteria to start with, you're left with, well, it's 0.1, it's between 0 and 1, a very, very low population. That 6D cook would typically be something like 70 degrees for 2 minutes, or 75 degrees centigrade we're talking about here. So 70 degrees centigrade for 2 minutes, or 75 degrees centigrade core temperature. If you're going to cook your burgers to that, the sort of McDonald's approach, then you're going to have a safe burger. But the assured sort of supply scheme relies not on that, it relies on a 4D cook. So a 4D cook, you can see, is really the one that's supplied up on the screen here with the blue text on it. So the blue bar there, if we started off with 100,000, then we're going to have a low level of bacteria present. But in order to achieve a 4D cook, you have to assure the actual handling and supply of the beef for that purpose. In this little diagram here, or the graph behind me, supplied by the Food Standards Agency in their guidance, it just makes the point that the number you're left with, theoretically, at 4D, depends on the number you start with. In other words, if you can reduce down the level of external contamination at the point of slaughter through the supply chain up until the point of applying a 4D cook, you can get to a similar place as a thorough cook, into a similar place, because you're starting down. Instead of starting with 100,000, you start with a lower level of external contamination, and therefore you don't need such a high level of cooking. That's the sort of theory here. So on this graph, you can see at the top there's a blue line. I don't know if you can see it on the screen behind me, but if you're watching this online, you can download it and have a look at it more closely. You're starting off there with a million bacteria start, and if you do a 6D cook, you're going to end up with 1,000. If you have a 4D cook, you're probably going to be in the region of 100,000 left after a 4D, because that's, you know, if you had 1 million start, that's going to be a very high level end point. But if you started off much lower. So if you only start off with 1,000 bacteria, then after a 4D cook, you're right down. You know, it's right down into the, I don't know, sort of 0.1s again, the sort of similar level as a thorough cook. So less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers either use external removal of contamination, searing, shaving, blanching, something of that nature, to remove the contamination, or they used an assured supply chain. But the assured supply chain is complicated. In England and in Wales, there is a legal requirement for any caterer who wants to place on the market, to put on your menu, a less than thoroughly cooked beef burger. And if you're using this 4D reduction, in other words, you're using the assured supply chain, then there's a legal requirement. It must come, the meat for that purpose must come from a specifically approved establishment. So this behind me is the 4-step approach advocated by the Food Standards Agency. It's a bit small for the screen behind you, but again, if you're watching this as part of our online training service, you can download this. I'll quickly run through it. Step 1 is at the farm. So obviously farmers have a responsibility to present cattle to slaughter in a clean state. We then have slaughterhouse, and the slaughter is about focusing on hygiene to prevent contamination. You know, no sort of using high pressure water hoses and stuff like that, spraying feces and other things all around the slaughterhouse. It's using appropriate systems and having an adequate system based on HACCP principles in place, so that there's extreme caution taken at that stage to prevent external contamination. We move on to the cutting plant, and the same sort of approach. The cutting plant would need to be specifically approved for the supply of less than thoroughly cooked burgers, if you like, to onto the caterers. And as part of that approval, their scrupulous hygiene conditions will be checked to make sure the beef cannot be contaminated by external practices, and also that the HACCP system is adequate to ensure that the external surfaces on beef are not going to be contaminated. There is also a requirement for some microbiological testing, just to validate and verify that the systems are adequate in the first place and are working in practice. And lastly, we come to the caterer. The caterer, say in England and Wales, are required to purchase, if they're using this 4D cook, they must purchase the beef from a specifically approved, less than thoroughly cooked meat establishment. The burgers then must be properly produced in accordance. They must notify the supplier of a particular specification. I didn't mention, but of course a key feature throughout this supply chain is adequate temperature control. So it's not just prevention of cross-contamination, it's making sure the meat is kept adequately cold throughout the process. And also they need to, if they're using a 4D, 4-log reduction or 4D reduction cooking process, that needs to be properly validated. In other words, demonstrated it works actually in theory, and verified to make sure it's working in practice within the establishment itself. So the systems based on HACCP principles that's in place in a catering establishment must specifically deal with less than thoroughly cooked burgers. Lastly, there is information. Now, this is not a control in its own right, it's just providing adequate information to the consumer at point of sale. It's not a disclaimer. In law, you can't disclaim against personal injury or death. You can't say, well, look, it's not cooked, so if you die, it's your problem. That's not permitted in law. So the Food Standards Agency recommends some wording. Of course, this is just recommendation, and you can use your own wording if it has a similar effect. So it says, burgers cooked rare, I have to read this from the screen, burgers cooked rare and medium rare carry a higher risk of food poisoning. Unlike a steak, a burger needs to be cooked through to reduce that risk. The Food Standards Agency recommends that children, pregnant women, and anyone with a weaker immune system have their burgers well done. Please ask us for more information. So you might want to put that on your menu or point of order, whatever it might be appropriate. Okay, well, there we are. That's less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers. That's just one out of a series of 100 videos that I'm producing on the topic of UK food law. Hopefully you'll join me on next one. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers.